They say when a baby is born, so is a mother. But while you are there to help your baby grow into the person he or she is meant to be, who is there to help you? Many women feel lost and alone when they become mothers, wondering, who am I now? Sometimes it feels like the transformation from woman to mother is as radical as a caterpillar's transformation into a butterfly. Did you know that inside the chrysalis, the caterpillar literally turns into goop before it rearranges itself into a butterfly? This podcast is about the goop, what soul transformation looks like as you transition from being a woman to a mom. Your baby's growth matters, but yours does too. You're not alone. I'm your host, Brittany Ming. Welcome to the Motherhood Metamorphosis. Welcome to episode 1 of the Motherhood Metamorphosis, a podcast about soul transformation with motherhood as a catalyst for that growth. I'm your host, Brittany Ming. This week, I wanted to introduce this podcast and the idea behind it and what I hope to accomplish with it. But first, I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. I've been married to my college sweetheart for almost 19 years, and I'm a mom to 5 kids, 4 boys and a girl. My oldest boys are twins, and my youngest baby was born in England when we were stationed there with the Air Force. I've experienced a whole range of birth experiences: C-sections, unmedicated VBAC, an epidural birth, NICU stays, a whole lot. I've been a writer for pretty much my whole life and a blogger for about 15 years. I'm passionate about mental health and have shared my experiences with anxiety and depression in my writing. I'm also passionate about growth, both for my children and for myself. I've struggled along the path of motherhood and have climbed some pretty tall mountains: miscarriage, learning disabilities, autism diagnosis, ADHD diagnosis times 4 kids, IEPs, anxiety, depression, moving, loss of career, and more. And I'm passionate about sharing my journey in order to provide a smoother path, or at least a shoulder to lean on as you walk your own journey. Back to the idea about this podcast. When I lived in England, I specifically remember the weeks some friends came over, and these 2 ladies became really my lifeline when my husband was deployed. We all had toddlers at that time. They both had 2 girls that were around the same age as my youngest. At the time when we were discussing this, my daughter was about 1 year old. And even though these ladies were about my age, mid-30s, one was older, one was a little bit younger, they were just 2 to 3 years into motherhood, whereas I had been a mom at the time for about 13 years. So we really had very similar ages of children, but really different experiences. And they were talking to me about how there just weren't books out there for this soul, life, or inner transformation that women go through when they become mothers that are not child or parenting focused. And we really just had a good conversation about that. And I was like, yeah, there really should be something about that. They both remarked about how life had changed so much for them. They were both working full-time before they became moms, and their careers were a huge focus of their life. They had friendships that weren't just focused on kids or who you met at the park. And they had a nightlife. They had a relationship with their spouse. But when they had kids, everything changed. And I was like, yeah, I remember that. I remember feeling that feeling of being lost and not knowing who I was anymore. And then I thought, yeah, I've been there, but I don't feel that way anymore. I feel the majority of the time settled and comfortable in who I am. But I thought, how did that happen? How did that shift happen? And I thought, wow, more people need to be talking about this because they were in the middle of that transition, that transformation, and feeling the squeeze, that uncomfortableness that I don't feel like myself anymore. And I don't really know who I'm becoming. And I'm taking care of these babies and these toddlers, and they need me so much. And I also need to feel like me again. And I thought, wow, we need to talk more about this. So we had a really good conversation that day. And we also laughed because we said, somebody should write a book about this. And then we really laughed because none of us had time to read because we were taking care of kids all day. So that's the reason this podcast was born, because we said, well, if there was a podcast, we could listen to it while we were walking or doing the dishes or folding laundry. Reading takes up a lot of mental energy and time, and that's something you just don't have when you have little kids. So I thought, well, how about a podcast? So I've been thinking about this idea for over a year and really just rolling it around in my mind. So that's the backstory to this podcast. A podcast about transformation with motherhood as a catalyst that's not necessarily focused on parenting or children. It's focused on who you are as a woman and who you're transforming into as you become a mother, and what that looks like in so many different facets. So who is this podcast for? I really like to think as a writer in terms of primary audience and secondary audience. Who's going to read this or who's going to listen to this? So I see my primary audience as women who are in the trenches of new motherhood. Whether you're pregnant, whether you have children 0 to age 5, I feel like those first 5 years are really transformational and really foundational for who you are becoming as a woman and a mom. I see the secondary audience as women who have been moms for longer, but maybe have had a new baby. Because I know as a mother of 5, and my youngest being now 2, I feel like I have to recreate or rediscover who I am now, being a new mom of 5. And my daughter was a big surprise. It just really rocked the foundations of my life. I'll talk more about that as the podcast continues in future episodes. But I have felt lost and having to figure out who I am now and what I want to focus on. So I see a secondary audience as maybe those first 5 years after your youngest is born, no matter how many kids you have. This is a podcast for mothers, wherever you are in your journey. So what can you expect from this podcast? I'm expecting to do mostly interviews with writers, interviews with mothers, friends that I've known from my past decade plus of being a mom, and also with women that I admire from social media who are writers or podcasters or people who have wisdom to offer in all different topics, whether it's about marriage or sex or hobbies or friendship or whatever you're going through right now. Like, how do you feel about your body? How do you feel about fashion, friendship, or pressures we feel from social media to do all the things and be all the things? I see this podcast as women encircling you and saying, you are not alone. I've been there too. Let me tell you my story. I'm here with you. As your soul transforms, as you become the person you're meant to be, and as you mother your children. So I wanted to share this story that I read on Facebook. A friend shared it, and it just really struck me as to this amazing metaphor for what I want this podcast to be. I'll share this story and link in the show notes. This is how the story begins. 2 days ago, I was out surfing, and a young guy, maybe 20 or so, was just inside of me by 10 yards. Suddenly, he started yelling frantically, "Hey, help me!" And as I started paddling towards him, he disappeared under the water for a second and resurfaced with a frantic look of terror on his face. "The leash is wrapped around my legs," he said to me as I got to him. "I'm here, I've got you," I said, knowing he was in sympathetic hyperarousal and his nervous system was dysregulated due to the perceived threat of being out in the waves, the leash wrapped around both legs. In a few seconds, his state shifted. The look on his face changed. The co-regulating process moved him from panic and survival physiology to a sense of being okay, that he wasn't in danger. It had passed. A few years ago, I was surfing on a fairly big day in Washington when I fell taking off of a wave and heard my collarbone snap. Right up against a rock jetty in 6 to 8 feet of water, survival physiology kicked in, and I paddled with my one usable arm to the beach and collapsed in terror and exhaustion. Another surfer came up to me, looked me in the eye, put his hand on my shoulder, and said, "I'm an EMT. I'm here. I'm going to stay with you. An ambulance is on its way." I can feel the tears well up writing this as I remember that moment. My body was going into a state of mild shock from the injury, but his calm presence allowed my nervous system to settle. His presence was co-regulating, allowing my physiology to settle a bit in the midst of a highly distressing situation. I likely would have developed a prolonged survival physiology trauma if he hadn't been there. His attunement didn't save my life. I had already done that by paddling with one arm, but it saved me from the potential pitfalls of an overwhelmed nervous system that stays locked in survival mode. I surfed the same spot a few months later, nervous I was going to be triggered, but I wasn't, thanks to that random stranger. I've never had triggering symptoms related to this event, something that so easily, could have robbed me of my deep love of surfing in the ocean. I'm here, some of the holiest words I've ever known. And I love that story because I see it as just this beautiful picture of how women need other women in the early days of motherhood, and how we need people to say, I'm here. We need people to share those stories, because we can get locked in this type of trauma survival mode when we feel alone, when we go through really distressing things. Even if we think, oh, tons of people have had a colicky baby, or I'm not the only one who goes through anxiety or depression after a birth. Yeah, my baby was in the NICU, but it's normal. Or why do I feel so sad when my baby is healthy and my birth was fine? Why am I struggling so much 3 years later into motherhood? We can get locked in this type of trauma survival mode that just really colors our motherhood experience. And not only just that moment in those years, if we have other children, we can get sucked into a trauma response later. I've seen this in my own life, and I'm specifically thinking of my younger son and how he started to have a lot of constipation issues. He was just so stressed about going potty, and he wasn't going number 2, and we had to go to the doctor and all these things. And I got really worked up about it because my older kids, one of my twins, had a lot of potty issues when he was around the same age. And his issues ended up with an impacted bowel and a hospital stay. So my youngest son didn't go through all that. It never got that far. We got him Miralax. It turned out fine. He started going. But I was getting really worked up about this because of the stress that we went through about 10 years ago, and I hadn't ever dealt with it. And I think that's really important to have those moments and have those times and people to come along beside you and say, hey, I'm here. I've been there too. Let me tell you my story. Let me hear your story. You're not alone. And I think if we can get those emotions and stories out of our system instead of pushing them down or hoarding our emotions, there's so much health behind that action. I think that's a path of wellness as opposed to a path of seclusion, and maybe even a distress situation like this surfer. So I want this podcast to be like an emotional doula. A doula is actually a word that means with women. Someone who aids you in your birth and helps you emotionally and physically and gives you support. I think that when we become mothers, we need those people to help us through and say, hey, I'm here for you. You're not alone. You can do this. People to be encouraging. So as your soul is transformed and as you are transformed, I want this podcast to be that cheerleader, that warm voice, the encourager, just boosting you on to where you want to be and who you're becoming. Thank you so much for listening. I'm excited about this. I'm looking forward to having you along for the journey. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Motherhood Metamorphosis. If you've enjoyed this episode, please hit the thumbs up and subscribe to this channel so you never miss an episode. Next, tell your friends. Podcasts are a slow growth type of social media, so promo works best when it's from person to person. If you know another mom who's in the goop right now, send her a text of encouragement and the link to the episode that is speaking to your heart right now. If you have a story about your own matrescence, the physical, emotional, hormonal, and social transition that occurs when someone becomes a mother, please leave a comment below. I want this channel to be a place where women can build community about the challenges and joys of their own motherhood metamorphosis. Thank you so much for listening today. I hope it encouraged you and gave you some good food for thought. If you ever have any questions, comments, or you'd like to reach out to me personally, you can email me at brittanyaming@gmail.com. And really longer than that, because this is a re-recording of the first podcast. So I'm recording this in 2024. The podcast originally launched in 2021.